Such that it does.
Okay, now it's recording. I got
Yeah,
it.
there you go. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, we're going to take a look at the outlook for October through December. So kind of our fall and maybe our first month of winter. And before we do that, we're going to take a look back at what ended up being a really miserable summer, especially when it comes to the heat. Not so much on the rainfall side of things, but the heat was really the big story in 2023 in the summertime. And so this is the rainfall departures from normal for 2023. And as you can see, this isn't anything glaring that stands out. Even as dry as it's been in June, July, and August, and the first part of September, um, there's not these great big anomalies, and a lot of this is because of the wet May and April, May, and the first part of June we had. And so when you average it all out, you can see we're not that far away from average. A little bit drier, kind of in the southern half of the state, and surprisingly pretty wet up in the northwest and west central parts of the state. And again, a lot of this was earlier in the year, and then it really just stopped raining in mid-July and hadn't really rained a whole lot since. And so that is where you see the bigger departures. If you just look at the last 90 days, there's certainly greater departures, especially coastal southeast Texas into southern Louisiana, and then back down towards Matagorda Bay. But the other thing you get into with respect to South Texas is you can see the impact there of Tropical Storm Harold, which impacted the areas from Corpus and Kingsville, kind of west northwest, in towards the Laredo area um, as we got into the uh, the late part of August, and that's really what saved from kind of a worse condition across South Texas than what we had. And the gradient cutoff was pretty sharp there. So, Victoria, Matagorda Bay, and areas further north and east really didn't get a lot of rain from Harold. A lot of that high pressure that was centered over the Midwest kind of pushed that precipitation down further to the south. All right, so the other thing to look at is the heat. The heat has really been the story, if you will, for this summer. So this is the number of 100-degree days through 9/24. So this was Sunday, and I think we're probably done at Victoria and Corpus Christi. Kingsville, Cotulla, and McAllen may still see some 100-degree days, and actually in 2011 they continue to add 100-degree days even into the late part of September. So these numbers may change a little bit for those locations, but for most, you can see here, minus Cotulla, 2023 is by far the most number of 100-degree days ever recorded. So this includes 2011, which was, a benchmark summer for a lot of us, and the summer of 1980. And what's very interesting about 2023 and 1980 is there's a lot of similarities with those 2 years. Not so much 2011. 2011 was significantly drier, and it was also hotter than 1980. But the similarities with 2023 and 1980 actually come with the landfall of a tropical system in South Texas. In 1980, it was Hurricane Allen, which made landfall and broke the heat wave and kind of broke the drought. And similar with 2023, although Harold was nowhere near the intensity of Hurricane Allen, and also Harold did not produce kind of a breaking of the heat and the drought, although the drought conditions in South Texas aren't as bad as they were in 1980 in 2023. And you can see the rainfall there, the departures, like the map showed, the worst location up around Victoria, the Victoria area, running about 7.5 inches below normal for the year. And kind of the wetter locations, McAllen, and then back out to the west. Of course, Cotulla doesn't get a lot of rain to begin with. And so the 14.97 inches in 2023 at Cotulla, a lot of that was in the spring. There hadn't been a lot of rain since then. But if you look at 2011, there just really isn't any comparison with 2011. It was just one of the driest years we've ever experienced. And even 1980, even though we had a significant amount of heat in 1980, kind of early in the season. So the heat in 1980 started June, July, kind of peaked in early August. And you can see the rainfall there in 1980. We actually had decent amounts of rain with respect to average across South Texas in 1980. So some similarities between this year and 1980. Big heat early kind of in the year. The difference this year is the heat has lingered on. I mean, we're still hitting 100 plus down south and west and deep South Texas and the Rio Grande Plains. And so we'll see where these all end up at. But I don't think Cotulla is going to get to 115 like we saw in 2011. But you can see the records there and how it compares with everything. A lot of these sites, look at Kingsville and places like that. They're just blowing what the previous years had out of the water. And one of the big differences between 2023 and 2011 has been the real high heat index value. So in 2023, in June and July, it was common almost daily for 115, 120-degree heat index values, especially in that Corpus Christi, Kingsville area, up towards maybe a little bit towards Victoria, not as bad down in the valley. And that is a big difference from 2011. 2011 was a lot drier with respect to the moisture, A, because the ground was a lot drier, and B, because the Gulf water temperatures weren't as hot as they are in 2023. And so the dew points, that moisture was mixing out a lot better in the afternoon, and we weren't getting these really incredible heat index values that we've seen this summer. And so that's another big departure. We don't really track heat index, and so it's hard to actually compare it. How many times have we hit 110, 115, 120? We don't really track that, but I do believe the 122 or 123 or 125 heat index value at Kingsville was the highest ever recorded in South Texas, and that was back in, I think it was July.
It's gonna be over there where
So this is Tropical Storm. We'll talk a little bit about Tropical Storm Harold. So this was obviously the biggest weather impact in South Texas, really for the summer months. And you can see this is the wind speed. Harold that's the storm that kind of developed right up near the coast, and we always have to worry about that in southern Texas. If you look at the angle of the coast, how the coast kind of makes that C shape, bend shape, it's very favorable for westward moving tropical systems to strengthen as they come into the lower Texas coast. And Harold was another example of that. We had this with several storms in the past, and Harold was another one. Given another 6, 8, 10 hours, Harold probably would have become a hurricane as it came in. As a relatively small storm. And you can see the wind speeds there, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, really just south of the Corpus area. Corpus did get some gusty winds.
With a long time ago. In the past. It's history.
So far as always talked about was the past.
Hey, folks, if y'all could mute your line.
And indicative of future on occasion.
Some people talking. And then we can go into the rainfall aspect of it. And this was really what folks needed in South Texas with respect to rain. It might have come at an inopportune time, trying to get things taken in. But as you can see here, a widespread 1 to 3 to 4 inches across the good bit. But then again, a very sharp gradient off to the north, not much rain, and same thing off to the south, not much rain. And so kind of that gradient there and very beneficial rains. Interestingly enough, it did very little for water supply in South Texas. Most of this went into the ground. There was not a lot of runoff. And so there was very little help with respect to rivers and creeks and lake water supplies, which have dwindled and are running very low. So we still need more rain down this area. But that was helpful that we had that. Things would be a lot worse if we had not had Harold come in. In typical Texas fashion, that's how we kind of do it here. Is you're in this drought, and a tropical system in the summer or early fall is how you sort of kind of get out of this. So I did want to take us through what has happened over the last several months. And so this was June 13th, again, coming off a very wet April and May. There was no drought in coastal Texas. I mean, we were completely drought free. And then we go to the July, and the drought starts to creep back. So this was about three to 4 weeks of really no rain, but really intense hot conditions. And you can see the drought starting to creep back in the coastal areas. And then jump into August 22nd and significant expansion, especially in the northern coastal bend into southeast Texas of the severe extreme drought, and even popping up the exceptional drought, which if you kind of look at the exceptional drought, it's about a 1 in 50 year sort of episode that happens. I don't know how much I believe that, because we've seen some exceptional drought pretty often here recently. And this is as of last week. So two things to point out. You can clearly see the stripe there of rainfall that happened with Harold across south central Texas, and the Rio Grande Plains kind of beating back on the drought conditions in that area. But that really sharp gradient off to the northeast and the exceptional drought expanding over a significant portion now of central and southeast Texas. And so this is not updated. The drought monitor comes out on Thursday, so this will update this week with the rains we had over the weekend and then yesterday. And there'll probably be some very slight improvement, but not likely a lot of improvement, because the rains honestly haven't been very widespread. They've been kind of scattered. And this is what we call the KBDI. This is a fire weather index, but it tends to show you where you have soil moisture. And so this is, if you look at the scale from 0 to 800, you can think about that as the number of inches below the ground. So 0 would be the top, 800 would be 8 inches down, and anything you see in that red color is 700 to 800 index. There is no moisture in the soil all the way down to 7 to 8 inches deep. And so this is big time concern when you start to talk about trees and larger shrubs and stuff like that roots go down. They don't go down quite that far, and so you start to see that moisture loss, and this is big fire weather. And there's been a lot of fire, especially in the eastern part of the state, in the pine areas. The good news is the recent rains can quickly change this, so we've really cut back on the fire concerns and greened up some of those what we call the fine fuels, the grasses, a little bit. But as you can see, things are not horrible across South Texas. Again, Harold helped a lot. You can kind of see the footprint there. But things are, when you get up towards Victoria and then kind of northwest over towards San Antonio, things are still pretty bad in that area. Although there's likely to be some improvement into this from the rains that we had on Sunday night in that area. And this is the burn bans. Interestingly enough, a couple counties have dropped their burn bans, Wharton and Jackson, Jim Wells, due to the recent rains. But still, there is concern for fire weather, and we're not out of it yet. The thing you have to worry about as we get into this time of year is when we will get a front, and it will happen. The dry air coming in, the gusty north winds coming in behind these fronts as we start to get into October. If we're not getting rain with the fronts, that will quickly dry out those fine fuels, and you can get fire. And one of the things that's really saved us this summer, unlike 2011, where we had big fires in September, is the lack of wind. We really haven't had a lot of wind and favorable conditions with dry air, and that's what's really prevented. We've been able to keep the fire to a few acres, 5, 10, 15, 20 acres. So crews have been able to get out there and deal with it, versus these big, 10,000 acre fires that we've seen back in 2011 with the wind. And so that's been the saving grace a little bit this summer. And so we'll talk about the sea surface temperatures. So much of what the weather pattern holds going into the fall and winter is what happens in the Pacific Ocean. And so this was January of this year. You can see we had the cool water there off the coast of South America. That's a La Nina condition. We were in a La Nina condition. The other thing that we talked about previously is just look how warm the oceans are. If you look at the Atlantic, very, very warm. You look at the North Pacific, very, very warm. And then fast forward now to September of 23, and it's just been a complete reversal of what we saw in January. So over about a 8 to 9 month period, we have seen tremendous warming in the equatorial Pacific, off the coast of South America to South Hawaii. Interestingly enough, the Atlantic continues to be very, very hot. And so there was this big debate about what was the hurricane season going to be like this year. And in fact, it has turned out to be a relatively busy hurricane season out in the Atlantic. There's been a lot of storms, not so much here in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see those blue areas in the Atlantic basin off the US East Coast, those are the tracks of the recent hurricanes that have been up across the Western Atlantic and pulling that heat out of the ocean and redistributing it northward. So that's obviously what tropical storms and hurricanes do. And you can see their cold wakes there showing up. And so, even so, the Atlantic is still very, very warm in the tropical regions, and the Gulf of Mexico continues to be very warm. Obviously, without a lot of tropical activity in the Gulf, there hasn't been anything to dissipate that heat. So the warm Gulf will continue, and this will probably have an effect on our temperatures as we go into the fall and possibly even the winter, until we can actually maybe get some cold air down here. So this is the typical effect of La Nina. This is what we've been in the last 3 years, warmer and drier, generally speaking, in the southern United States and Texas. And for the most part, we've certainly been on the warmer side of things, and we've also been on the drier side of things. And this is the typical impact of an El Nino winter, fall, winter, and spring. And so, a lot of people have asked, well, we went into this El Nino in the summer, but it hasn't been raining. If anything, it's been super dry. Why is that? And it's because the effects of El Nino really don't impact the southern plains in Texas until you get into fall and mostly in the winter and then maybe into the spring. So you kind of look at that period from about October through March and April as the biggest influence El Nino is going to have on the southern plains in Texas. And so it really has very little influence on the southern plains in Texas in the summer months, although there is some suggestion that our heat ridge, the big dome of high pressure that kind of set up over northern Mexico, southwest Texas in June, and that started our whole transition into this brutal summer with heat and dryness, was enhanced some by El Nino. That is not a typical thing we've noticed before, but it is something we might look into. Is there somewhat of a connection between El Nino coming on as it did this spring and a developing ridge of high pressure over northern Mexico and potentially the southern plains? This was very different than what we saw back in 2011. 2011 was a La Nina event, and the ridge of high pressure developed directly over Texas. And so obviously late 2010 into 2011 was very dry here, one of the worst droughts. And so that matches very well. But what we have seen this summer does not match really well with historical past. And there could be a lot of other reasons of why that's going on. These are the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, just kind of shown in another way. So the Nino 4 region is the furthest west. This is south of Hawaii. And the Nino 1 and 2 regions are the furthest east. So this is over off the coast of South America. And you can see everything is in the positive. A lot of the locations are plus 1.5 degrees, which would bring us to a strong El Nino. So we're kind of fluctuating. It kind of bounces back and forth between about 1.3 and 1.8 on average across the entire equatorial Pacific region there. So this is definitely a moderate to strong El Nino that we have in place. But one of the things that hasn't really happened yet is that we haven't seen the atmosphere couple with the warm water. And so we haven't seen a displacement of a lot of the showers and thunderstorms from the Southwest Pacific, where they typically are, over towards the Central and Eastern Pacific. And we need that displacement to happen to change the upper air patterns that result in some of the influence that we see El Nino cause. One of the other things that's very interesting is we haven't really seen a pressure difference also at the surface between, we look at Tahiti and we look at Australia, Darwin, Australia, and there hasn't been a significant pressure difference in a weakening of the trade winds. And so even though we have an El Nino, even though the water is very, very warm, for some reason, it is not coupling with the atmosphere yet. And we're kind of, in that holding pattern of when is this going to happen? Is it going to be something that's going to flip very quickly? And this is probably another reason why we have been able to get away with a fairly active Atlantic hurricane season, because the wind shear just hasn't really been, at least in the Atlantic, very strong. Now in the Caribbean, the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, it has been, which is a very favored El Nino thing. But out in the Atlantic, things have been significantly un-El Nino-like, but there could be other reasons for that. One of them is the Atlantic is just so warm. So this is kind of the prediction here of El Nino, the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. And so you can see where we're at. You can see we kind of peak in that December, January, February timeframe. And what's interesting is a lot of the models quickly drop things off as we get into spring of next year. And so you kind of see El Nino quickly coming down. I don't know if it's going to be that fast. I guess it could be. We certainly saw it come on very quickly, but to dismantle that amount of warmth is going to take some time. And so this may be a little bit aggressive in how quickly it drops the El Nino down. And at this point, there's no indication of a multi-year El Nino. So we just got done with a multi-year La Nina, 3 years in a row, back to back. Right now, if you look at this, this is suggesting that we're going back towards neutral conditions by next summer. We'll see. We'll see how that works out. There's a lot that goes into this, and a lot of times those predictions are a little bit off. And so what's the forecast looking like? These are the longer range models. The CFS is the American longer range model for October through December. And you can kind of see some patterns here. One is an above average precipitation anomaly across the southern plains. That would not be surprising in an El Nino year. One thing that's sort of surprising is you don't see the above average anomalies in Florida or the southern United States, which you would like to see or you would expect to see in an El Nino year, or across northern Mexico. So not really sure where this anomaly is coming from here in the southern plains. It almost looks like some sort of stalled fronts or something like that. But this doesn't look like a traditional El Nino fall, early winter for us, which would be a wetter than average forecast from Florida along the Gulf Coast back to Texas. Sort of see the signal in Texas, but not further to the east. This is the European model, again, for the October through December timeframe. Now, this is a much more favorable El Nino look. You can see that wet pattern there across the southeast and the Gulf Coast. Kind of exactly what you would be expecting. I would expect that to trend, to pull a little bit further west into Texas, but that's not what it's showing. It's just showing us with near average precipitation here in Texas. The other thing to make a point of, even though this is the October through December period, if you do the monthly looks, it looks like October ends up being kind of dry here in Texas. So we continue the dryness of September into October, and then the precipitation really starts to pick up as we get into November and December. And so this may be skewing that a little bit because October is kind of dry. That's what it's showing up as. And so it may be kind of muting it down a little bit. This is the Canadian. Again, not a strong signal here, kind of surprising, given the fact that we have such warm water in the Pacific. Not a lot of a signal here along the Gulf Coast for above average precipitation. If anything, maybe a little bit of below average in Texas, again, probably in the October timeframe. And then this is the multi-model consensus. So you put them all together, and this is what you get. And so you can see the trend here is trying to get that El Nino pattern going there with above average precipitation in Florida and along the U.S. Gulf Coast. Interestingly enough, it seems a little suppressed. Kind of what I mean by suppressed is to the south. And so with our fingers crossed here, we don't want to see this suppressed to the south, and we don't want all the precipitation end up in the Gulf of Mexico. We need to get this back a little bit further to the north and west so we can get some beneficial rains in Texas. And I think they will come, but I don't think they're going to be in early fall. I think it's probably going to end up being later this year, November, December, and then into the spring months. So this is what the human forecasters have put out, kind of based on the models. They're a lot more aggressive and turning more towards the traditional El Nino look there, wet in the south and east in Florida, and then kind of back into Texas on that western side of it. So, hopefully for us, this is what pans out. Again, this is probably more November, December versus in the October timeframe. And, the bad news is October tends to be one of our wettest months. So May is the wettest, October is the second wettest. And so if we don't see a lot of precipitation in October, we're going to see some of those deficits really pile up. So we'll see how that goes, but that's kind of the concern. Temperatures, again, this is the American. No real big surprise here. It's warm. El Nino tends to be warm across the northern part of the United States and Canada. And we hear in Texas, oh, it's going to be wet and cool. That doesn't mean freezing cold like 2021 when we had the winter storm, or even last December. It tends to be you're cloudy and drizzly and days of light rain. And so, when you don't get the sun shining in the wintertime here, you might have lows in the 40s and highs in the 40s. So you low of 42 and a high of 45. You just don't get a big range in temperature when you're locked in with thick clouds and drizzle and that type of stuff. And that tends to be what we see down here in these El Nino winters. But when people hear the word cool or cold, it doesn't mean that we're going to have big freezes and that type of stuff. As a matter of fact, El Nino tends to not support the big freezes like we've seen recently down into the southern plains. So cool is kind of a yes, we'll probably end up below average on some of the months, especially as we get deeper into winter. But that's more of a function of the cloud cover. And if you have cloud cover during the day and you have clouds at night, you don't get as cold at night. So the chances of actual freezing temperatures, obviously they're there in the wintertime, but these big falling into the teens and 20s and stuff like that probably isn't on the table as much with this winter coming up. See the Europeans a little more aggressive with the near normal temperatures, if you will, across the western states into the central plains. It's kind of the only one showing this, and if you kind of look at it, it's some sort of a high pressure ridge, maybe there south of Alaska, that's allowing some cold air to come down. I didn't look at this, really in depth. I'm curious now that I'm looking at it, is if this is showing more towards the November, December timeframe, which I imagine it probably is. But the other thing to note is just the huge expanse of above normal temperatures outside of really the central US and the western US. So just a continuation of the very warm conditions we've seen for the last 10-15 years. The Canadian, same thing. This is sort of an El Nino pattern, warm in Canada and the upper Midwest, and then still above average temperatures, but not brutal heat for the southern US. And then the multi-mean, trending towards what we would normally expect to see with this type of a pattern coming up. So the equal chances there, so kind of near normal conditions across the plains. And then here in Texas, nothing that really stands out. With really above average temperatures or anything like that. So we might actually by November, December have near average temperatures for the first time, and I don't even know when, for winter season in the southern plains of Texas. So we'll see how that all goes. The drought outlook, this is probably the most optimistic news of all of this is the belief that as the precipitation starts to come in the October, really after the October, but the November, December timeframe, that we will see improvement in the drought and potential there for drought removal in the southern plains. We really, I think we're sort of desperate for this at this point. We're kind of at that point in Texas where you get into water supply. We still have decent water supply, but it's getting critical in some areas, especially the central part of the state, the southwestern part of the state. And we're also starting to see since it's been hot and dry for so long, we're starting to see the impacts on bigger vegetation. Trees are starting to die and stuff like that. And so we're kind of at that point now where we really, really need to start getting precipitation. We need to wet the soil, and we need to start producing runoff, because really the rains we've seen over the last couple of weeks have produced very little, if any, runoff. They've had very little response, and statewide our reservoir storage continues to fall. And so even though it's raining, we're not generating anything into the lakes and for our water supply. And so at some point we need to get to that point where we start generating runoff and can start filling some of these lakes up again. I think Lake Travis is down almost 55 feet. So it's approaching what it was back in 2011. And so, it's starting to get to that point, and hopefully we can remedy a lot of that this fall and winter with El Nino. So this is kind of a recap, nothing really surprising here. Above average rainfall likely in that November, December, and then into the springtime. Above average temperatures, generally speaking, probably trending more towards normal as we get into November. And I'd even kind of go out on a limb here and say maybe a little below normal as we get into December, just because with more rain and clouds, you're going to not be very warm during the day. And about near average soil moisture once we can get the soil to finally wet, moisten up a little bit. All right, so we'll take a look at the what we've had so far with the 2023 hurricane season. Some interesting things have happened this year. So I think we're at 17 named storms today with Philippe out in the Atlantic, and kind of what we thought was going to happen has transpired. We did not think we'd see a lot of activity in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico due to El Nino, and that's exactly what's happened. The one storm that was able to kind of sneak through was Harold, and again, it found that kind of sweet spot, if you will, coming right up to the Texas coast, and really forming quickly there, 12 hours before landfall. The other one was Adelia in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, which made landfall up in the Florida Big Bend area, and that's really been it for anything threatening the United States this year. And so El Nino has done exactly what we expected to do with wind shear across the Gulf and Western Caribbean, but a lot of activity out in the Atlantic. And so there was, as I mentioned earlier, back when we did the seasonal forecast back in June, with El Nino coming on, is it going to beat back the season? Are we not going to have the big numbers? Or is the very warm Atlantic going to be able to still produce a very active season? And it seems to be, even with El Nino, the very warm Atlantic basin has been able to produce the numbers. One thing I will say is we really haven't seen the quality of storms. Yes, we had, I believe it was Hurricane Lee that became a Category 5 briefly, but a lot of these storms have struggled. Even the Philippe out there now is struggling with wind shear, and so a lot of this has been, tropical storms, minimal hurricanes that have really struggled in the basin. And so even though the water temperatures have supported this, that upper level wind shear has been present, and it's really produced kind of these marginal tropical systems this year. You can kind of see with all the blue is the weaker systems, and you can only see there's 2 or 3 there in the Atlantic that got strong. So Lee, and I don't remember what the other one was. So the other thing is a lot of these turning north, we just haven't had the big subtropical high that usually anchors around Bermuda. Has not been there this year. And this is one of the reasons why the Atlantic is so warm, is because without that high, the trade winds have been relatively light. And so it allows those tropical waters to warm a lot. And so a lot of these storms have been able to turn north and completely miss, the Caribbean islands and the United States. And so what's interesting is if you look at the track map and kind of look at that forecast that we were looking at earlier in the season, the blue areas highlighting kind of below average, and the red areas indicating above average potential for tropical storms and hurricanes. The forecast looked pretty good. You can see not a lot there in the Caribbean and Gulf, and kind of off the U.S. East Coast. That was kind of where we expected a lot of the activity to be, and then out in the Central Atlantic. So this area here and over here, and so that's exactly kind of what's transpired this year. So this is a fairly significant win, if you will, for modeling, when you look at being able to, look at this in May and June and say, yeah, I don't, we're probably going to be fine for the most part on the Gulf Coast, and we have been. And then I would be, watching if I was on the East Coast. And luckily for the East Coast, the storms have been, about 500 miles or so further east than what was being shown here. So anyways, that's what we have now. We still have a couple more months to go. For Texas purposes, we're done. We're usually done the third week or so, fourth week of September. Certainly, I think we're done this year. The pattern just doesn't support anything moving west in the Gulf of Mexico. And on top of that, we have 50 to 60 knots of wind shear out there anyway. So even if something tried to get into the Gulf, it's probably going to get sheared apart. One thing we do have to watch, for U.S. landfalls is down in the Western Caribbean. So the Western Caribbean tends to be a hot spot in October. It'll be interesting to see if anything can get going down there with kind of the upper level winds not as favorable this year, but that tends to be the breeding ground in October for anything that may come up and threaten Florida or the eastern Gulf of Mexico. But for the most part, we're done here in Texas. And you know, like I said earlier, we got what we needed from a tropical system. We got the rainfall. We didn't have a lot of significant damage from Harold, and so we got exactly what we needed from a tropical system this summer. All right, with that, I'll take any questions.
I'm gonna stop recording, Jeff, and then we'll take questions.
Okay.